Welcome to the preview of our tutorial on software as a medical device, reporting AI in healthcare via responsible AI. The tutorial is a result of a collaboration between myself, Dr. Steve Overman, Christine Allen, Vikas Kumar, Ankur Teredesai, and Dr. Carly Eckert. Some of the earliest applications of AI in healthcare go back to the 1960s. Proliferation of massive healthcare datasets has expanded the application of AI and machine learning within the healthcare domain. It's been estimated that total global healthcare spending in 2017 was 7.8 trillion or 10% of the global GDP. Additionally, diagnostic accuracy of AI/ML models in radiology and diabetic retinopathy have shown massive performance improvements over baselines. Taken together, what all of these factors imply is that there's potential via AI and machine learning to improve the quadruple aim in healthcare, which is to improve healthcare outcomes, improve patient and clinician experience, and reduce healthcare costs. Before discussing the regulatory landscape or even the elements of responsible AI in the context of healthcare, we must first define what constitutes software as a medical device. It is defined by the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, IMDRF, as software intended to be used for one or more medical purposes that performs these purposes without being part of a hardware medical device. From the perspective of automation and decision making, we can divide these devices into four distinct categories. First, there's the zeroth level, that is absence of automation. These correspond to the complete absence of automation where clinicians perform tasks manually without any device assistance. The second level is assistive devices, in which there is an overlap in what clinician and the device contribute to the task. Such overlap constitutes or occur when clinicians need to, let's say, confirm something or approve device provided information or even decisions. Autonomous information is the third category, which corresponds to separation between what device and clinician contribute to the task. And lastly, autonomous decisions correspond to situations or scenarios where device provides the decisions for the clinician task, which can then be enacted by clinicians or even the device itself. Now we define what constitutes responsible AI. In the last few years, there have been multiple proposals regarding what are its constituent elements, so this list is an amalgamation of all these. Responsible AI constitutes transparency, explainability, fairness, robustness, and ensuring privacy and security. Responsible AI in healthcare should have concordance with ethical principles which are widely adopted in the context of healthcare. These are as follows. Non-maleficence, that is, do no harm. Autonomy, patient's input should be respected. Justice or fairness, fair use of resources and allocation of resources regardless of one's background. Beneficence, promoting well-being. Dignity, that is, patients and physicians have the right to dignity. If we look for specific ethical principles for use of AI for healthcare, we discover that no such principles have been proposed for adoption worldwide. According to a report by the World Health Organization that came out in June 2021. This is surprising given that the application of AI in healthcare opens up issues of safety and responsibility at scale with the possibility of positively or negatively affecting the lives of hundreds of millions or even billions of people. Additionally, lack of regulation in this domain also means that in case of misalignment of corporate interests versus public goods, the former may dominate. Another thing that complicates this matter in a negative manner is that there's a lack of complementary expertise in both healthcare and machine learning and AI. And so it's not often clear what constitutes responsible AI in healthcare and even what needs to be regulated. As a consequence, this is leading to the phenomenon of ethics washing or ethics bashing in AI. The problem is that ethics in the tech industry is being used for cause for self-regulation in order to avoid government regulation. Ethics washing is the use of ethics with shallow appearance of ethical behaviors to ward off regulation. Ethics bashing, on the other hand, is the phenomenon that ethics is being trivialized as having an ethics board or a plan for governance as a consequence of ethics washing, rather than a primary mode of thinking. The misunderstanding underlying ethics bashing are as follows. Philosophy and ethics are being seen as communication strategies or as a form of cover-up or facade for unethical behavior. The role or importance of ethical thinking is being downplayed or portrayed as mere ivory tower thinking. And ethical thinking is often being portrayed as in opposition or alternative to political representation or social organization. In general, legislation lags behind technology. If you look at the various guidelines in this domain, then there are a few that come to mind. For example, the FDA's guidelines on AI and machine learning in software as a medical device, the Council of Europe's guidelines on artificial intelligence and data protection, the Toronto Declaration on Machine Learning and Human Rights also have many relevant clauses. And additionally, various governmental agencies have issued guidelines uh, over the years. So, for example, the FDA, in the European Union, there's the EMA, or European Medicines Agency. And in terms of legislation, the European Union's GDPR is relevant in terms of how it details regarding handling data, requirement of explainability of decision making when it comes to AI and machine learning models. In the USA, the Algorithmic Accountability Act was proposed a few years ago, but it has not been passed as a legislation. Now we look at the limitations of regulatory bodies' regulatory scope using FDA as a paradigmic example. The 21st Century Cures Act excludes from FDA's regulatory regime devices that support or provide recommendations to healthcare professionals such that they have the opportunity to independently review the basis of a recommendation. In practical terms, what it means is that it excludes things like devices which are intended to support or give recommendations and with respect to preventing, diagnosing, or treating diseases, devices which need to be independently reviewed by a healthcare professional. In other words, a large subset of AI and ML models which are currently being used and deployed. The other relevant piece of legislation is Section 1557 of Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits health entities from discriminating against patients on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, sex, or disability. Some courts have permitted disparate impact liability on all grounds prohibited under this section, while others have not. To complicate matters further, the Office of Civil Rights within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which is tasked with implementing and enforcing Section 57, does not have a policy regarding how to handle ML cases. A detailed analysis of the legislation coupled with the FDA's guidelines reveal a number of shortcomings. Firstly, FDA's guidelines do not cover models for predictive modeling in administrative settings, which in a number of cases can have potential adverse effects on patients, especially in scenarios where there's some sort of resource allocation involved. The added caveats introduced by the 21st Century Cures Act leaves a large portion of healthcare AI technology unregulated. Additionally, none of the FDA's proposal frameworks adequately address the potential for disparate impacts. Even in instances where the FDA does plan to regulate device clinical support systems, the focus will primarily be on safety and effectiveness rather than on tackling AI ML bias. And lastly, FDA's recommendations are non-binding. If we zoom out and try to generalize to other national and international regulatory bodies when it comes to AI and ML in healthcare, then we observe the following shortcomings. In general, there is lack of specifics. For example, prescribing fairness as a requirement without specifying what constitutes fairness. Uh, Discussion of traditional norms of ethical guidelines without realizing that many of the norms may not carry over in the context of AI and ML. Insufficient focus on the ML process or product lifecycle, that is how ML is done in the real world. Lack of specifics also imply that reconciling ethical norms with Silicon Valley's fast growth, fast failure, and getting to the market first mentality is not going to get us to an equitable solution. Lastly, lack of sanctions imply that there is minimal deterrent to poor practices. To illustrate with specific examples of regulating AI ML, consider model performance, which is often assessed using data that is easily available rather than which reflects the target population. Model performance is often measured using statistical measures and is often conflated with demonstrating clinical impact and utility. The problem is that the clinical users are often left ill-prepared to assess whether a model is generalizable in a particular setting or not. Another example is consider AUC, which is widely used as a metric for classification problems, but in fact is a bad metric for real classification problems. We will discuss these and many more within the tutorial itself. To address some of the limitations of traditional ways of reporting machine learning models and their performance, we now focus on some concrete efforts at transparency and systematic reporting of machine learning models, which are domain agnostic as well as domain specific to the healthcare domain. We focus on three prominent proposals. The first one being from IBM, Model Facts. The second one from Google, Model Card, and lastly, from Duke University, Model Facts. Uh, in all three cases, there are few elements of model reporting which are common. So things like defining the scope of the model, what's the purpose, the intended domain, what kind of training data that was used, the inputs, outputs, what constitutes bias, how the bias is measured, uh, uh, performance metrics, how the metrics were used, so on and so forth. In case of model facts, uh, these are actually inspired from drug facts from FDA. So it has additional things like uses and directions, so specifically geared towards a medical or clinical audience, warnings, risks involved, applicability or non-applicability in domains. So for example, if the model is trained in general population, then it will not be applicable for a pediatric population. To illustrate the problem of some of the major hurdles that regulatory bodies face, consider the following. There's a lack of standards even within the industry, owing to the fact that large-scale deployment of AI/ML systems is relatively new. And complementing that is a lack of expertise in regulatory bodies. A lot of the top talent actually goes to Silicon Valley instead of choosing to opt to work for such organizations. In terms of practical recommendations, so things like review of training data sets for bias, how does one do that? What does that constitute for certain use cases? How does one test for disparate impact? Model analysis for fairness and bias. So these are some of the things which are missing. Another interesting problem is the traceability of harm. That is, how does one attribute responsibility within a complex system in which responsibility is distributed amongst multiple entities? It's a problem which is not unique to AI or ML. But here the problem is that because of the long causal chain involving software developers, data scientists, healthcare personnel, domain experts, there's diffusion of responsibility. So the problem is that we may end up in a scenario where everyone's problem becomes nobody's responsibility. There are few proposals on how to address this. So one concrete proposal, which is something which already exists in New Zealand, is what is known as no-fault compensation, where the idea is that patients seek compensation for medical injuries through a no-fault, no liability scheme. And this is something which may be applicable to machine learning models in the future. To examine some of these issues in detail, consider the following. So we start with the question, are machine learning models products? The question is important because from a product liability perspective, for most use cases of AI models, it's limited because most of these are considered services and not as products. And it makes sense because a number of things like, let's say there's concept drift, context bias, and given the black box nature of many of these machine learning models, that limits the applicability of current regulatory regimes and even defining what constitutes as a product. So it makes more sense to consider these as services. In addition to that, there's the learned intermediary doctrine, which limits the liability for developers. So what does that mean? Uh, it basically means that, let's say, when a doctor prescribes drugs or devices for which the manufacturer has provided adequate information, let's say warnings and risks, so the line of causation between a product developer and the patient who may suffer harm. So that line of causation is broken. So within our tutorial, we'll go over these and additional examples in detail. So to address some of the concerns regarding, well, how do we overcome these regulatory shortcomings? So we just give a very high-level overview in this preview. So there are issues related to data protection, data sovereignty. There are things like federated data, how that can partially help us navigate some concerns regarding responsible AI in healthcare. Uh, the classical notions of clinical trials, they don't really hold in the context of AI and machine learning. So one has to, let's say, design for values. Uh, and if anything goes wrong, then how is blame assigned? And there are many other issues. So one recommendation would be that if you look at the guidelines that the FDA has for the industry for statistical principles for clinical trials, they are much more detailed as compared to many other guidelines that they have, even in terms of what they have for machine learning. So that may be a good model for the FDA to follow. And we should look at the problem of responsible AI from the perspective of operationalization of machine learning models, and how does that look like from the perspective of the machine learning cycle? So if we just focus on one particular issue within responsible AI, that is bias. So throughout the cycle, we can talk about different types of biases. So there's historical biases in terms of data generation. It's the reflection of the world. There's representation bias that could be related to, let's say, data provenance and how the data is sampled, how the quantities are being measured. That's another type of bias, the measurement bias. When we are building the models, then which particular model is being used. So let's say they are, in general, simpler types of models are less biased, although they may have lower predictive capacity as compared to more complex models. That's another place where bias can creep in. There's bias in terms of how the target variables are being defined, how the models are being evaluated, and lastly, when the model is in the wild, how it's being used. So when we address the question of responsible AI, we have to zoom into these individual constituent elements, in this case for bias, and address these. And in our tutorial, we will go into detail regarding these. To wrap things up, we focus on some practical measures that we are working with respect to addressing the gaps that we have discussed within this tutorial. We have released 2 open source Python machine learning libraries towards that end. FairML Health, which we released last year, focuses on measuring different notions of fairness in the context of healthcare, although it's generalizable to other domains. A new version that we just released actually focuses on measuring and defining fairness in regression problems, and it's the first open source package to do so. The second package that we are releasing focuses on model templates, which expands and builds upon the idea of model cards and model facts, which we discussed earlier. The idea is that given a model and some additional information, it would be possible to generate these model reports, these model templates automatically, so that the end user does not have to do these additional efforts in order to have something like model facts or model cards. Lastly, a few words on additional resources and where to find additional information. So this was a preview of the tutorial where we will go in much more detail and depth regarding the various subjects that we have already talked about, in addition to some of the other things. Along with the tutorial, we are also releasing a survey study on requirements for responsible AI in healthcare from the perspective of different stakeholders. I already mentioned the open source libraries that we are releasing. And the Responsible AI in Healthcare resource website, which is listed here, it has all of this information in addition to where to find additional resources, research paper, government reports, regulations. So I encourage everyone to check those out. And if anybody has questions, you're always welcome to contact us. Thank you.